Oaths, Pacts, and the Moral Failure of Trying. A lot of Dungeons & Dragons players view their world like they're a bunch of cowards. There are two classes in the general oeuvre of Dungeons & Dragons who spend their lives in pursuit of a goal, having committed themselves to the will of something outside of themselves to have the power enough to achieve it. One of them is the Warlock, the other is the Paladin. The Paladin is built out of a traditional vision of the questing knight. English speakers might recognize them as sort of the Knights of the Round Table, but not the jerks. They derive their name from the French word for Knights of the Palace, the Palatine. The notion was that those knights closest to Charlemagne were just the bestest dudes ever, and we wound up using that term to describe an idealistic holy knight on a quest. In Dungeons & Dragons terms, paladins are armed characters who, in addition to the very material advantages of has sword, have the blessing of a god or godly power that gives them magical stuff, like resistance to disease and the ability to heal. The Warlock's name derives from the old German Wehrloger, meaning oath breaker, the idea that the Warlock is a sort of human who derived powerful magic from promises. Promises that usually had some implication of faith in God. Basically, Warlocks petition dark powers for the force of their magic. I wrote a whole thing about this some years ago, though it wasn't really very good, don't worry about it. They tend to be seen as trickster spellcasters, wily and, well, literally diabolical, with much hoo-ha about who they're asking for power, creating different kinds of flavor to their abilities. There is a joke about paladins and warlocks that one of them has an employer and one of them has a sugar daddy, and the difference is which one of them has a contract. Paladins and warlocks share something else as well, in that they're both classes that a whole class of dungeon masters seem to think of really stupidly. In the design of everyday things, Donald Norman expands on a pre-existing idea of affordance. Affordance is the idea that your environment offers you things. You see things around you, and those things are made to offer, or at least signal, what they're offering to you. And yes, for those of you who've read the book, I am simplifying for a YouTube video. A great example of this is a fidget cube. The faces of a fidget cube are all very much designed to look like normal, sensible, and familiar interface elements. There are dials, which are notched so you can tell they're meant to turn one by one, and you can feel that when you interact with them. There are buttons that are all sized about a fingertip size. The joystick has a depression in it about the size of a fingertip, and that complies with the range of motion of the joystick. Everything here is designed to be interacted with, and when you interact with it, it gives you meaningful feedback that it did the thing it's supposed to do. This is an example of affordance. The fidget cube is showing you the things it's for just by how it's designed, and you can tell looking at it. This is what this is meant to do. There is a problem with tabletop RPG design where the information we present to players can create unintentional affordance. This isn't the same thing as players elbowing in their own affordances, such as the claim that owning a cart makes you a landlord, like I've seen some absolute ding-dongs try to forward when talking about Hardwired Island. Instead, we're going to look at this in light of specifically Dungeons and Dragons. Now, for this bit of historical conversation, I'm going to be discussing the interface presented in the 3.5 Dungeons and Dragons books. This is because it's available on the D20 SRD, 4th edition avoids this problem entirely, and I have no interest in becoming any kind of expert in 5th edition. These rules are 20 years old. The mindsets that permeate these books have been the foundation of our now, and by addressing an old books version of this thing, I want to avoid the idea that I'm telling you how to do things based on a current consideration of current rules. This is about how they are designed And if you see this design problem in things you're more familiar with, maybe consider if that's a problem. Dungeons & Dragons presents its core rules in 3 books because they can afford to. One of those books is the Monster Manual, a manual, unsurprisingly, full of monsters. One of those books is the Dungeon Master's Guide, which is for specialized information for running the game, and one of them is the Player's Handbook, which, and I know this seems pretty ridiculous to state because it's on the cover, is for players. Now, some might see it as inappropriate to divide the systems of the game like that, and how the Dungeon Master is a player as well as the rest of them, but whatever, that's a conversation for another time, and you're right. The important thing is that the Player's Handbook is a set of rules for players to engage with. It is presented as stuff players should know. The Player's Handbook is where you'll find the rules for heritages and classes, rules for feats and powers and skills and spells, all that good stuff that players love to have and to use and that make up the bulk of how you interact with the game and the game's world. In the Player's Handbook, it presents the Paladin. The Warlock comes along later and the complete arcane. Don't worry, we'll get to them. They're also classes. They're squarely in the realm of what the game tells you players care about. By default, whenever a class, not a prestige class, a class is presented in 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons, it is presented as a player option that is available for a player to consider as a way to make their character. They have direct agency over it. This constructs a language that things relating to the player are the things presented as player options. What is shown as a feat, prestige class, spell, or skill is something players get to have access to. When you see these things in other books, even books that are ostensibly for the DM, they are still player options, and therefore you know how to engage with them. That's where the next stage of affordance comes up. In the spell list of 3.5, there was this one spell lurking around like a mind virus waiting to infest. Atonement. It's there. It's a player option, right? Like all the other spells players can use. Now, this spell is not meant to be a player power. Not really. The spell is a fix. It's there because the Paladin is meant to have a code of conduct presented in the Paladins class section, and the game designers felt they needed some way to say players can fix that when something goes wrong. It's an understandable need. You have the code of conduct, you need a rule for violating it, and then you need some way to fix that so players aren't left with a defunct character. This is part of the problem of treating character building like it's constructing a game piece and then requiring advancement to take literal months of playtime. Investiture becomes part of it. Now, there's a lot going on with Atonement, like the way that it kind of represents a very American idea that money is how you apologize for things. But Atonement, in the spell, has a bunch of rules about how falling as a paladin works. And that means it covers such details as 1. You can fall as a paladin, even if you didn't know what you were doing was wrong. 2. A deity is required to atone a character's situation, but it doesn't have to be the paladin's deity. 3. You can fall as a paladin, even if you were mind-controlled into doing it. 4. Paladins can't atone for themselves. They have to get it cast for them by a cleric or druid. And 5, the caster has to pay a cost to cast this spell. This is all the information for players presented in Atonement. In the spell that fixes the violation of Code of Conduct, the text of the Paladin, the rules and standards they must maintain, we instead get the much smaller Code of Conduct. A paladin must be of lawful good alignment and loses all class abilities if she ever willingly commits an evil act. Additionally, a paladin's code requires that she respect legitimate authority, act with honor, not lying, not cheating, not using poisons, and so forth, help those in need, provided they do not use help for evil or chaotic ends, and punish those who harm or threaten innocents. The code of conduct is pretty vague, and I can see why you'd do it this way. This is functionally a roleplay guideline, something so paladins will behave differently to fighters, for example. Now, I think there's a lot of better ways to do that, and in 4th edition they did, he huffs. But the basic idea is here. You aren't setting this up as a list of ways to make paladins' lives suck. You're setting it up to be a way to penalize paladins for not sticking to the point of paladins. So far, so good. Now we're at the point of affordance. The game has in it this big button marked Atonement. It has a standardized, systemic fix for falling paladins. Now, I played a lot of 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons, something like 7 years, and during that entire time, not once did we need that Atonement spell. Paladins were played by people who wanted to play paladins and weren't looking for the DM to kick their teeth in over the gamer crime of being too good. Still, it seems a generation of gamers and DMs looked at this Atonement spell and seemingly assumed it was a natural endpoint of the life of the paladin. Any story of the paladin would need the moral complexity, nay, the failure of that paladin. Then we have the Warlock. Introduced in 3.5 D&D's book, The Complete Arcane, the Warlock became a fan favorite despite the fact that it was kind of pants. Bonus, their low power level was a great indicator of the kind of GM you were dealing with. Because the Warlock did spell stuff all the time instead of on a limited drip, there were players and DMs who were convinced the Warlock was overpowered, despite the fact that it was kind of worse than a fighter with a bow. Warlocks made non-specific pacts with evil powers and were granted boons because of it, with names like Diabolic Majesty, which were extremely sick and also garbage that you could replicate with a magic item. You could make a Warlock do broken stuff, but only by buying a bunch of wizards' wands. The Warlock in 3.5 had a rough start, but then in 4th edition it got graduated up to the core set, in part I think because there was a nice obvious design space for them alongside the wizard. Wizards did spells that messed with people, controlled space and time and minds, but Warlocks shot holes into your soul. Warlocks further differentiated themselves with the idea of pacts, where you could pick a different flavor of horrible spookiness to throw your soul to in order to gain power. There were Star Pacts, Far Realm Pacts, Fey Pacts, Demonic Pacts, Pacts with Dread Sorcerer Kings, and they were all great. And then 5th edition came around and, I don't know. I don't like or play 5th edition. I don't care about that system. I don't want to care about that system. It's extremely tiring to me to see a really good system displaced by a system that shares the same 2 lies about 4th edition. But with 5th edition, we do have more Warlocks, and the pacts and patronage are still there. It has been years. 5th edition is here. I'm allowed to have picked stuff up without being able to chapter and verse you on this one. If nothing else, I've watched enough shows where people are playing 5th edition. Around sometime in 2018, a conversation in the Dungeons and Discourse came up and reared its ugly head as a bunch of long-time public figures who were involved with the hobby and guided less experienced players started to talk about their mechanics for handling Warlocks, and as a direct consequence, the conversation turned to Paladins. There is some toxic posturing going on in this community at this time, let me tell you. The community leaders and voices that wanted to talk about how to teach people how to play D&D, the ones with sponsored shows and streamers and the people who have literal fan bases, just have some fantastically toxic ideas about what makes for a good game. And it all came out in these spiraling, noisy threads of self-important, punitive piss. The Paladin, it seems, is a class you're always trying to dupe into making moral choices that punish them. Players are assumed they will give up loot opportunities, or be forced to work alongside villains, or suffer the presence of awful people, because the DM is constantly playing a kind of shell game with them, as if we're not all over Bioshock Infinite style, but these people are bad too nonsense. Warlocks, the suggestion went, should have an invisibly increasing meter that resulted in the patron just eventually deciding they'd had enough, and given enough, and it was time now to drag the Warlock to hell. That's that. Not only did people laud this idea, but other voices in the community of public dungeon masters lauded this. this is ridiculous, and it's disgusting. There are two classes here that are unified mostly in that they have an ideology underpinning their mechanics, and these people spoke about them as if these two classes deserve to be singled out to have their players lose what they worked on, what they cared about, because they made a mistake without ever being told about it to play these character classes. This is terrible game design. Not the base game itself, not D&D. The GMs are running a game, and the game they're running is a game they made design decisions over. The design decision that sometimes Paladins are just screwed is a bad design decision. My opinion of this is that it's an issue of affordance. These DMs see that there's a button you can push to unbreak these classes, so they got it internalized in their head that the natural existence of these characters is to wait to be broken. This is an issue of game interface. Falling, rising, ideals, and what they empower you to do are broken down into game mechanics, suggesting an idea that this is just another lever or switch you can flip or turn, that an immense ideological collapse and destruction of your personal faith is just a fun game mechanic to throw at people like they're goddamn flumps. But there's more to it than that. There's the true foulness at the heart of it. I think, to an extent, part of this is about engaging with the game in a way that your story is about generating drama and encouraging engagement more than it is about telling a coherent story with a specific theme or an ideology. In that case, you're going to make a story that isn't really about anything as much as it is taking the story elements presented to you and making them make the maximum of noise for the minimum of movement. Time to put the thumbscrews to the Paladin and time to doom the Warlock. Roll up another character, Karen. You made a mistake 6 months ago and you should know better. In the end, the Paladin and the Warlock are characters united in that they are characters whose ideology drives how they treat the world. Warlocks willingly surrender something of themselves for power. Paladins willingly subject themselves to a code of conduct in the name of achieving greater ends. When you take that kind of character and see their failure as inherent and inevitable, you are telling me something about who you are and what you believe in. It says that anyone who cares enough to try and make things better should watch their mouth. It says that using something dangerous to any good ends is itself dangerous and should be punished. It says to me that you're the kind of person who sees a status quo of suffering as acceptable because changing it would involve making a fuss. I love Warlocks and Paladins. I have more to say about Warlocks and Paladins. And perhaps because I love them so much, I hate when people put the stories around them to be about punitive, cowardly, centrist pissantry.